All right, so I want to start with a big thank you. Thank you so much to everyone who's attending today. I'm really looking forward to this one. I've talked to multiple people today, and the common thing that we've all said is, who doesn't love turtles, right? So a little bit of a cheat topic today. I think most of us are really excited about it. Again, just want to thank you for being here. My name is Elizabeth Creech, and I am a Natural Resources Communication Specialist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and managing this webinar series in collaboration with our partners and our Conservation Assessment Project leads. Conservation Effects Assessment Project leads is one of my main responsibilities. So really looking forward to this one. Happy to be here today. Before we get started, I'm going to cover just a few logistics. So first and foremost, if you would like to receive email notifications with information on upcoming webinars, please subscribe to the NRCS Conservation Outcomes topic via Gov Delivery. You may do so by following the instructions on the screen, but a direct link to access this will be available in the meeting chat shortly. So as soon as I finish talking, I will drop that in the meeting chat. If you're having problems with audio today, sometimes computer or mobile device headsets can help. It may also help to quickly leave and then re-enter this session. You may access live captions during this webinar by clicking the three dots with the word "More" on the meeting screen. This will enable you to select the Turn on Live Captions function. And again, please note that I will momentarily post additional links and resources in the chat. One very important resource is our Conservation Outcomes webinar series webpage. So that URL, nrcs.usda.gov/conservation-outcomes-webinar, is currently displayed. And this is where you can find a suite of resources for this webinar series. Right now, you can find a one-page additional resources guide for this webinar. And then by early October, we'll have the recording posted as well as the presentation slides. Finally, we encourage everyone to type questions or comments into the chat throughout today's presentation. We'll address as many of those questions as we can during a Q&A session at the end of the event. And if we don't get to your question or you have a follow-up thought afterwards, you may email me directly at elizabeth.creech@usda.gov. With that, I think it's time to get started. It's a true honor and privilege to introduce our Natural Resources Conservation Service Acting Regional Conservationist for the Northeast, Mr. John Hubert. Regional Conservationist Hubert, thank you for joining us today, and sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's an honor to be here and a privilege to be able to kick off this discussion. From my perspective, we have an opportunity to do a lot in our public service. We're working on private lands, and we're being problem solvers to help the producers that we're working with to work out natural resource concern issues on their land in a way that benefits not only themselves, but benefits society as a whole. In our efforts to do that, it always helps to have science on our side. Today, we're privileged to have Dr. Roberts be able to provide us with some insights from his findings that will help us to be better problem solvers. So I encourage you to listen in today, pay attention to what we can learn about the science that will help us to better deal with the resource concerns that we're working with our private landowners on. And I will turn it over next to Charlie Rewa, who is the Wildlife Assessments Lead for USDA's Conservation Effects Assessment Project, otherwise known as CEAP. Charlie, we'll go to you.
Okay, thanks, John. I'm trying to share my screen here. I think you can see that. Yeah, thanks, John. I'm Charlie Rewa, the leader of the Wildlife Assessments for the Conservation Effects Assessment Project. And I want to thank everybody also for joining today. We're really excited to share some outcome-based findings and insights generated from CEAP science partners at the University of Massachusetts to help inform our efforts with private landowners to conserve at-risk freshwater turtles on working lands in the Northeast. But a few words on CEAP in general, CEAP Wildlife. Since 2005, we've conducted over 100 different outcome-based CEAP wildlife assessments through cooperative agreements with science partners and universities, NGOs, and other federal agencies. And the assessment findings are shared, with reports and other documents on the SEEP website, which is one of the URLs in your packet today. So SEEP Wildlife has worked closely with our Working Lands for Wildlife effort, which focuses on generating win-win solutions for producers and at-risk wildlife in various landscapes throughout the country. And the Working Lands for Wildlife Northeast Turtles effort is an example. But our understanding of how turtles use wetlands within working landscape has been incomplete. So in 2019, SEEP Wildlife worked with our state and Working Lands for Wildlife staff to engage scientists at the University of Massachusetts to help fill this information gap. So today's webinar will present findings from these studies and shed light on how we can inform effective management of landscapes for these at-risk turtle species. So with that, I'd like to just turn the floor over to Dr. Patrick Roberts for the main webinar, and I'll be back at the end for the Q&A session. So Patrick, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you for that introduction, Charlie. Okay. So thanks again, Charlie, for that introduction. I'm really excited to share my research with you. The title of this talk is Informing Turtle Conservation in the Northeast by Thinking Bigger in Space and Time. So I think a good place to start this talk, and really any talk about turtles, is with what makes them so special. And of course, that is their shell. All turtles have essentially evolved to fit their entire body within their own rib cage. And in turn, that rib cage has evolved to basically function as a full suit of body armor to protect it from threats like predation and other factors. And since this body plan emerged on the scene around 210 to 250 million years ago, around the same time that dinosaurs were also appearing in the fossil record, the body plan of the turtle has essentially remained exactly the same. So the world has changed around them. Turtles have become, dinosaurs became dominant and then they went extinct 60 million years ago, but turtles have remained relatively the same. And I think that's a real testament just to how successful their life strategy has been. So when we think about the life history of turtles, all turtles, not all turtles, but most turtles share a similar set of characteristics. So most show very low reproductive output, very delayed sexual maturity, often up to 10 to 20 years before an individual can sexually reproduce, also very small clutch sizes. There's also generally very low juvenile recruitment. So in some populations, nest predation can be up to 100% for a given year for a given species. And there's also generally very high juvenile predation. So these two kind of negative factors are really only offset by extreme longevity and high adult survival, and really the ability to reproduce into old age, which is often, up to 70 to 100 plus years in the wild. So these factors really come together to mean that populations generally display long generation times, often up to 50 years before a single individual can replace itself within the wild. And that also means very slow population growth. So this is how we think populations function naturally, quote unquote, naturally, outside of the influence of humans. So you can imagine when we start to introduce threats to turtles like habitat loss, land use, illegal trade, human subsidized predation, and the kind of myriad other factors that affect turtles across the globe, we start to see population declines. And some studies have suggested that even removing a single reproducing individual from a population every year can result in relatively steep or dramatic population declines. So as a result, many of the experts in the field have suggested that this is one of the most endangered vertebrate clades in the world. About 68% of species are threatened with extinction, and there have been a number of kind of high-profile papers that have tried to draw attention to this real conservation crisis. So when we come back to this idea of the life history of most turtles, it really has implications for conservation and population persistence, trying to keep populations on the landscape. But it also has implications for management, which I think is why we're all here. So I'm going to emphasize this, I'm going to provide a couple of examples comparing the eastern box turtle to a songbird species, the chestnut-sided warbler that the NRCS actually often manages for in the Northeast. So both of these species generally like kind of early successional shrubland habitats. And under this example, let's assume that we identify population decline, and we decide to implement restoration, habitat restoration, to address this population decline. And hey, maybe it's successful. We see population growth. We see the population start to rebound. The big difference between these two species is the scale of recovery. The temporal scale of recovery for a chestnut-sided warbler is going to be on the order of years, relatively quickly. We're going to be able to see that response. On the other hand, for the eastern box turtle and turtles in general, the scale of recovery is going to be on the order of decades, and in some cases, maybe even centuries. So some people think that the eastern box turtle is actually still recovering on a population level to the widespread deforestation that occurred in the mid-1800s in the Northeast. Kind of moving on to our second example regarding dispersal. So if these squares kind of represent theoretical landscapes and the circles indicate patches of habitat for these two different species, and we decide to create a patch of habitat, not too close, but not too far away either. This time to colonization for the bird, because they can fly and they explore the landscape, we know is going to be around, probably 1 to 2 years. However, on the other hand, the scale of colonization for a turtle is going to be on the order of most likely decades. We don't have great data, but we know it's not going to be quickly. And once they get there, it's going to be another several decades before they can really reach their carrying capacity within that patch of habitat. So this is what it's like to manage for turtles, and we really need to be thinking in the long term for this species. So this is really the backdrop for this agreement with the NRCS, and we really broken up this agreement into two kind of sub-projects. The first sub-project focuses on the level of the individual, studying the movement and space use of individual turtles. The second sub-project focuses on it kind of moves up to the level of populations or groups of individuals, focusing on the environmental and anthropogenic factors affecting demographic parameters of populations. So jumping right into our first sub-project, we're calling it Comparative Long-Term Spatial Ecology of Long-Lived Turtles. And when you kind of delve into the research around spatial ecology for freshwater turtles in the Northeast, there's a wealth of research. It's very well studied, and there are kind of a couple of common threads within that research, one of which is that most species tend to show high interannual site fidelity, meaning that individuals tend to return to the same location year after year. And this has important implications for conservation, because if you can get to know a population really well and understand its movements really well, you can theoretically, under the assumption of high site fidelity, delineate that population and kind of assume that they're going to stay within that area. And then with that, you can apply land protection. And that land protection, in theory, will protect that population from certain threats like habitat loss and other associated factors. So this is kind of the linchpin of turtle conservation. However, one kind of relatively big concern related to this assumption of site fidelity is that most of our spatial ecology research is relatively short-term in scale and temporal scale. Typically 1 to 4 years, very rarely any greater than that. So if you compare this, so say a 2-year study, the scale of a 2-year study, to maybe the conservative lifespan of an individual turtle, maybe 80 years, there are many other factors like natural succession, the transition from one community to the next, or anthropogenic disturbance, the periodic anthropogenic disturbances that may shift resources spatially on the landscape and thus affect space use by individuals. There may also be kind of the gradual, seemingly random shift in home ranges over time. Year 1 might be similar to year 2, but what about comparing year 1 to year 10, year 20, year 30 down the line? So the concern, the fear here is that we're putting this hard-fought resources into land protection for a population, but over time, the boundaries of that population may spatially shift, essentially rendering that land protection ineffective for that population. So that's kind of, with that in mind, we implemented this sub-project with the kind of the basic objective of investigating and describing the long-term fidelity of 3 species: the spotted turtle, the wood turtle, and the eastern box turtle. All species of conservation concern in the Northeast, particularly the spotted turtle and the wood turtle, are currently petitioned to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. Fortunately, we had 3 studies that really intensively studied each of these species previously. So Liz Wiley studied the eastern box turtle 13 years prior to this study. Mike Jones studied the wood turtle 14 years prior. And Joan Milam studied the spotted turtle 25 years prior to this study. And this work all took place in Western Massachusetts, primarily within the Connecticut River watershed. So the first thing we did was we revisited these sites where the previous studies took place, and we intensively sampled those wetlands, as well as the surrounding landscape, to capture any potential individuals that moved into the surrounding landscape. And we tried to catch as many of those exact same individuals that were previously tracked as we possibly could. And we had remarkably great success. We captured about 67% of those previously tracked turtles. Unfortunately, we weren't able to track them all, so it ended up being about 60% of those individuals. So 68% of eastern box turtles, 61% of wood turtles, and 50% of the previously tracked spotted turtles. So once we caught them and we were able to identify them based on their unique notching code on their carapace, and we placed radio transmitters on their carapace and tracked them consistently throughout the year. So 1 to 2 times per week from their emergence in typically kind of early May or late April through the entire active period to the overwintering period, which typically occurs in November. So here are a couple of examples of our field technicians tracking turtles in, say, flood conditions or through vernal pools. And I always like to give examples of kind of turtle behavior that we don't typically see. So this is an example of a wood turtle doing its best to hide from me in the leaf litter of a mature forest. So this circle down here indicates the turtle's head kind of poking out from underneath the leaf litter, keeping an eye on me. Here's a great example of courting wood turtles in a nice, clear, cool stream. The male is on top of the female, kind of poking his head into her carapace, trying to see what's going on. So it's always fun to see this kind of behavior as you track them throughout the year. So getting into our more quantitative methods, we had 2 main ways of understanding site fidelity. The first was more traditional within turtle research. We estimated the percent overlap of mapped annual home ranges. And this is more traditional in turtle research, but it has a couple of flaws that have been identified in the broader spatial ecology research. And so we also used another method that's generally more preferred. And that was to measure the straight line distance between individual points within relatively small periods of time. So in this example, the shorter distances indicate higher site fidelity, and greater distances equal lower site fidelity. And we measured site fidelity at multiple temporal levels. So at the biggest level, we measured fidelity at kind of the annual scale, all movements throughout the entire year. But we also looked at the seasonal level, so biologically meaningful seasons. We split it up into these different segments and measured site fidelity. And last, we measured overwintering site fidelity, so the specific location that a turtle decides to hunker down for the winter. So down here, I have an example on the bottom right. I have an example of a box turtle kind of that's been buried down into the soil, and that was its overwintering location. So to get you kind of prepared for what these results are going to look like, I'm going to go over in a kind of a theoretical example. So to assess the degree of long-term fidelity, we compared it to the level of short-term fidelity for each of these species. So in this case, short-term fidelity means fidelity measured at the short term within study periods. So in this example, from 1 year to the next, 1994 to 1995. And if we measure that across multiple year comparisons, we can come up with an overall estimate for short-term fidelity as plotted on this graph. But we can also look at long-term fidelity, so across periods in this case, 2018 to 1995, and we can plot that on the graph as well. So greater distances between these points indicates lower long-term fidelity, and shorter distances indicate higher long-term fidelity. So the distances between these study periods in this example on the right here is similar to that of the short-term fidelity, suggesting that we have very long high-term fidelity or high long-term fidelity. So getting into our results, I just like to start by showing how some of these home ranges mapped out. Here's two great examples of very high long-term fidelity. The two different types of lines indicate the different study periods. And as you can see, for these two individuals, an eastern box turtle on the left and a wood turtle on the right, for the years that we studied them, they seem to have almost identical home ranges. And it still kind of blows my mind every time I see this, just how identical they were over multiple decades. So high long-term fidelity in that case, but in this case, for a spotted turtle, we saw kind of the opposite. We saw a shift of the entire home range several hundred meters away on the landscape. So there's quite a bit of variation. So getting right into our results, as I was describing before, that's what those plots look like. Here we show annual home range overlap, and indeed, for all these plots, I want you to take note of the stars up here at the top, and I don't seem to be able to use my my cursor here, but these stars at the top of the plots indicate statistically significant differences between short and long-term fidelity. So indeed, we do see that there is some shift in the long term of these home ranges. There is a difference between short-term and long-term fidelity, but we still see very high estimates of fidelity overall. So for these short-term estimates, particularly for the wood turtle, for example, in the middle, that's the highest measure of site fidelity for any turtle species that has ever been reported to our knowledge. And when you look at the long-term fidelity estimates, so the circles in green, those are still quite high and actually on par with fidelity estimates for short-term studies for these species and other research projects. So still very high long-term fidelity, although we do see variation among species. So for example, long-term fidelity for the spotted turtle is actually quite lower than both wood turtle and box turtle on the whole. So moving on to our seasonal results for females. Again, these plots are a lot. I want you to focus on the stars up there at the top. And first, I want to emphasize just this y-axis that we've shifted over to the distance metric. So the higher values indicate lower site fidelity, and it's also at the log scale. So distances actually get more and more scrunched together as we get further up on that y-axis. But coming back to these stars up here at the top, I want to emphasize just how few of these seasons for females show statistically significant differences. So suggesting that at the seasonal level, females show very high long-term fidelity. It's very little difference from short-term fidelity. When we do look at these seasons that have statistically significant differences, there are two that really pop out: the nesting seasons for both spotted turtle and wood turtle. And we kind of zoom in on these and look at more continuous estimates of fidelity throughout the year, with yellow indicating short-term and green indicating long-term. We can see this gap in the nesting period a little more easily. And I think this gap is really interesting. It has some interesting management implications. Both of these species tend to nest in ephemeral nesting, in ephemeral habitats. Nesting habitats. So disturbances, so in the case of wood turtle, a disturbance like a flood comes in and exposes soil, and they nest in it. And in fact, in this example of a nesting beach here, you can see some wood turtle tracks moving right across it. But over time, vegetation colonizes and renders it unsuitable for nesting. And so females have to, again, find nesting habitat on the landscape. So these results suggest that we're catching the temporal turnover, the temporal scale of turnover in nesting habitat, and really suggests that females are, in this time scale, exploring the surrounding landscape to find new nesting habitat. So I think it has interesting management implications that I'll go over in following slides. But moving on to our male fidelity results for seasons, in contrast to females, we see that there are more statistically significant differences among seasons, suggesting that particularly for spotted turtle and wood turtle, they're generally showing lower long-term fidelity than females. There's also this interesting pattern of kind of relatively flat pattern across the seasons. They're all kind of similar across the seasons in general, suggesting that as opposed to females that kind of have this spike in the nesting window, that overall there's not as much of a seasonal effect. So far, we really focused on fidelity between individual years, but we were also interested in the cumulative long-term space use for a given individual, and particularly whether we could draw conclusions about whether studying an individual within a short period of time could make inferences about long-term space use. So we asked the question, how well do annual home ranges and their buffers reflect long-term space use? So the first thing that we did was we took the annual home ranges and we combined them together, all the points that were used to make those home ranges together to make an estimate of long-term space use, or a long-term home range. At the same time, we took those home ranges and we applied a series of buffers ranging from 0 to 200 meters. And then we put them together and we estimated the percent overlap with the long-term home range for each of these home ranges and their buffers. And we repeated this for each annual home range for each individual within each species. And we can create these nice plots for each sex. So here we have the different species and the different line type and color. And for females, you can see that on the left here for 0, we have the different buffer sizes on the x-axis, and for the 0 buffer, so the annual home range, we have very high overlap with the long-term annual home range, between 65 and 85%, ranging across the species. So very high at that low level, and then it jumps up at 50 meters and increases toward about 95% for all species at the 200-meter buffer, suggesting that yes, individual home ranges. So if you study an individual home range and you apply this buffer to it, it's really going to encompass most of its multi-decade long-term space use for these individuals, average individuals within these populations. And if we look at males, we see a similar pattern for eastern box turtle, but for males, this although it has the same kind of overall arch to it, it's generally lower. Although at the 200-meter buffer, we do still see relatively high, greater than 70% overlap for the male, suggesting that they are still sticking in the surrounding landscape, but they do shift their space use over the time, as our previous results suggest. So before I move on to the conclusions, I want to emphasize some caveats. So I think our results are potentially biased toward more sedentary individuals because we focused on those previous places that these populations were studied. So we're more likely to capture the individuals that stuck around that area. There could have been individuals that moved very large distances in that time period. So our results could be overestimates of our fidelity metrics. But there are several reasons why I think this is probably not the case. And I don't really have time to go over those right now. Also, I think that not all populations are going to be the same. Landscape context, individual behavior, maybe habitat suitability is probably going to vary between populations. But there is some degree, we can be confident to some degree that populations are very similar to each other based on previous spatial ecology research. So in general, I think this is quite novel information about that can add to this body of research around freshwater turtle ecology. To our knowledge, no one has studied long-term spatial ecology of any freshwater turtle as intensively as this study. It has yielded interesting findings, in particular that overall we see very high long-term site fidelity across species, although they did shift to some degree over time. Indicating that they're really sticking and using these same areas, and they're really kind of largely home bodies, at least these 3 species. But even still, these results suggest that the long-term effectiveness of land protection is likely going to vary by species. So it might be more effective for the box turtle, which showed the highest levels of fidelity across sexes, but maybe less effective for the spotted turtle, which generally showed kind of the lower levels of site fidelity. And also suggests that long-term protection, land protection, is going to be less effective for male spotted turtles and wood turtles, which seem to shift and use the surrounding landscape a little more often. And lastly, coming back to this idea of seasonal fidelity for females, we saw that there was lower long-term fidelity for females in the nesting season. And I think this really suggests that we should, that there might be some benefit to periodic nest site maintenance for populations, because it means that females might not necessarily need to venture out into the surrounding landscape to find new nesting habitats over time. So for that, I would like to move on to the second sub-project of this agreement, which we're calling the effects of landscape structure and land use on turtle demographics across the eastern United States. And first, I just want to point you towards these two papers that have already been published with respect to the analyses that contributed to this sub-project. And before I get started, I need to emphasize how collaborative of an effort this has been. There is a long history, now nearly 2-decade history of intensive collaborative conservation for individual species in the Northeast. And you can find the results of this work at northeastturtles.org. And in particular, this project is derived from kind of a now 6-year-old regional spotted turtle conservation project ranging from Maine to Florida. And so we use the data from this project. And it has involved really countless biologists from dozens of state, federal, academic, and nonprofit institutions. So truly a collaborative effort that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. So as we've kind of gone over, there are a number of different factors that can affect turtle populations. We've gone over the threats. Environmental factors can also affect populations, and then they can affect populations in a number of different ways. And for this sub-project, we focus on 3 distinct component of populations: abundance, juvenile recruitment, and sex ratio. And I'm going to focus on abundance first here. And specifically as it relates to landscape pattern, and particularly how the degree of landscape complexity affects turtle populations. So when we think about landscape pattern and landscape complexity, we typically come to this idea of landscape heterogeneity. And the body of research out there around this has identified 2 key components of heterogeneity. On the x-axis, we have compositional heterogeneity, and on the y-axis, we have configurational heterogeneity. So you can imagine a simple landscape with a single type of habitat patch surrounded by a kind of unsuitable surrounding matrix. And we can make it more configurationally complex by just breaking up that patch into more complex configurations, or we can make it more compositionally complex by keeping that arrangement, but just increasing the number of different habitat types, cover types for that species. And of course, these are independent of each other, so we can increase both at the same time. And landscape heterogeneity is fairly well studied within the broader ecological research, but there are some major taxonomic gaps, and turtles are definitely one of them. So that was really the goal of this project, to understand the influence of landscape heterogeneity and human land use on turtle populations across the eastern United States. So we had 2 main predictions. The first was that overall abundance would increase with compositional heterogeneity. So in this case, as the number of different wetlands or wetland diversity increased, we expected that regardless of species, abundance would increase as well, because we thought that there would generally be a benefit to having a variety of different resources for a number of different reasons. But this is a kind of a well-founded theory within kind of broader landscape ecology research. Our second prediction was that, and it was a little bit more complex, was that configurational heterogeneity would interact with land use to affect the abundance of populations differently. So in this case, wetland aggregation is our proxy for configurational heterogeneity. And I have 2 example landscapes here. On the top, we have high wetland aggregation, so a single large patch of habitat. And on the bottom, we have low wetland aggregation, so more kind of a constellation of smaller wetlands dispersed across the landscape. And the idea is that as the surrounding landscape becomes more fragmented, there are more threats on the landscape, we expected that wetland aggregation would interact to affect the relationship between abundance and land use in different ways. So, for example, on the top here, we expected that this population would have very little reason to use the surrounding landscape in these contexts, mainly just to use the surrounding landscape for nesting. Females have to nest in an upland habitat, typically once a year. So females are vulnerable to the surrounding landscape within a relatively narrow window of time, but males have very little reason to use the surrounding landscape. So as a result, we thought that there would be a relatively minimal relationship with land use in these contexts. On the other hand, when there's low wetland aggregation, wetlands dispersed across the landscape, we thought that they would still need to have to nest. But there's also this need to, of course, move between wetlands to either find new foraging habitats, to search for mates, or probably many other factors as well. And this would overall increase the vulnerability of that population. So as a result, in these contexts, we expected a much stronger negative relationship between abundance and land use intensity. So moving on to our methods, I'm going to go very quickly through this. We established a standardized sampling protocol with our regional working group and applied it to shallow wetlands across the eastern portion of the spotted turtle distribution in the kind of the Atlantic coastal plain from Maine to Florida. We characterized the landscape at multiple spatial scales, ranging from 30 to about 7.5 kilometers. We characterized compositional heterogeneity, looking at wetland diversity, specifically using the Shannon Diversity Index. To get at configurational heterogeneity, again, we used wetland aggregation using the aggregation index in FragStats. And to characterize land use, we used the National Land Cover Database and focused on 4 different land cover types: road density, impervious surface, crop cover, and hay pasture cover. In total, we ended up sampling 531 distinct sampling plots across this area, and from 2018 to 2020. And this yielded about 5,000 turtle detections across 12 turtle species. A lot of these species didn't have enough data to really conduct analyses, so we ended up with 7 focal species: the eastern mud turtle, the snapping turtle, the painted turtle, the Blandings turtle, the spotted turtle, the yellow-bellied slider, and the striped mud turtle. So getting right into our results, we saw that compositional heterogeneity, with respect to compositional heterogeneity, we saw pretty broad support for our prediction. All species except for one, the eastern mud turtle, showed some sort of positive relationship with wetland diversity. So suggesting that perhaps the idea that having a greater number of resources in the surrounding landscape may be beneficial for populations. And one good example of this is for the spotted turtle, which is thought to really benefit from having vernal pools nearby due to the abundance of amphibian larvae and egg masses during that kind of early period of the year when they're just starting to emerge. So moving on to our configurational heterogeneity results, with respect to, we saw fairly mixed support with respect to our prediction. So on the one hand, we saw support for the spotted turtle. There was at kind of low aggregations. So wetlands dispersed across the landscape, we saw a strong negative relationship with hay pasture cover. But as wetlands became more aggregated, we saw that this relationship seemed to dissipate. And even at the highest levels of aggregation, we saw this potentially even positive relationship with hay pasture cover, although I would view it with a grain of salt because there was quite a bit of standard error associated with it. But nevertheless, it suggests that there is a context-dependent relationship with this land use type. And again, we think our explanation is that it's due to the extra vulnerability of moving between wetlands when there's they're within less aggregated contexts of wetlands. So I'm not going to go into the details explaining this relationship, but I want to emphasize that we did not see the same pattern for all species, including the snapping turtle, which showed essentially the opposite pattern. Although we do have explanations for this, but I don't really have time to go over it. I do want to emphasize our results with respect to roads, which are thought of as kind of a primary threat to turtles in North America and globally. So on the one hand, we saw the kind of the expected pattern of strong negative relationships with road density for both the spotted turtle and the eastern mud turtle. They're both very terrestrial species that encounter roads regularly, so we expected this negative relationship. On the other hand, we saw that there was no relationship for 3 species, including the painted turtle depicted here in this photo here. This lack of relationship is actually relatively consistent with the literature, which have really struggled to detect a relationship with roads, suggesting that maybe for some species, the relationship is more complicated, or it's less present than other species. There's variation among species, and indeed, on the other side of things, we saw actually a positive relationship for both the snapping turtle and striped mud turtle. And this relationship, it was relatively perplexing, but when you dig into the research, you actually do see some support for this, particularly for the snapping turtle. So potentially there are, in certain contexts, there may be somehow a positive relationship with roads for certain species. And our best explanation yet, I think, is the idea of predation release. So it's possible that roads are suppressing predator populations, which then could result in an increase in recruitment and introduction of juveniles into a population, which grows the population. And there is some research to suggest that this could occur and could potentially even compensate for the effect of road mortality on adults within populations. So moving on to juvenile recruitment. I'm not going to focus on the methods too much, but when we typically focus on, we're typically most concerned about reproductive adults within populations. But we also really care about juvenile recruitment because, of course, if a population is going to rebound to a threat or respond to a threat positively, it needs to introduce individuals into a population. So for this portion of the project, we were only really able to focus on spotted turtles because just for logistical purposes. But getting right into our results, we saw on the y-axis here, we have the proportion of juveniles within a population or a sample. And we saw strong, similar to our abundance results, we saw strong positive relationships with wetland diversity. And we also saw a strong negative relationship with road density. Again, very similar. Interestingly, on the other hand, kind of in contrast to our previous results, we actually saw a strong positive relationship with cultivated crop cover, suggesting that there may be benefits to recruitment despite negative effects on other factors in the population. So our best explanation of this is that potentially cultivated crop cover are providing nesting habitat for spotted turtles. I think more research needs to be conducted on this relationship, though. So now moving on to this third component, sex ratio. It's definitely not the first parameter that we jump to when we're concerned about a population, but if it gets skewed to one direction or the other, too far towards males or too far towards females, we can have kind of devastating implications for a population. A complete loss of reproduction, and also major effects on genetic diversity, which can ultimately lead to local population extirpation. And there's actually quite a body of research focused on this subject for freshwater turtles. And the prevailing main theory around this idea goes like this. In relatively unfragmented landscape contexts, we expect that a population sex ratio is going to be stable at whatever its resting sex ratio is. But as the surrounding landscape becomes more fragmented, we expect them to become more male biased because females need to venture out into the surrounding landscape to nest, and as a result, during these excursions, they might suffer greater mortality. There's great support for this, strong support for this relationship, but there are also many studies that actually show no effect, no observation of this relationship, and some studies that actually show the opposite pattern. So obviously, to me, this suggests that there's potentially a mediating factor that is controlling this relationship. And from my perspective, thinking about landscapes and configuration of habitat, that my brain jumps to how wetland configuration could potentially play a role in this relationship. So it's possible that this predicted pattern does occur, but primarily at high wetland aggregation contexts. So as land use intensity increases, the proportion of male increases because females are more vulnerable and males have very little reason to leave that wetland. However, at low wetland aggregations, we have the need to nest, and we also have the need to move between wetlands, as I already described. And so the question is, as the surrounding landscape becomes more fragmented, what's the effect on sex ratio given this added mortality? It's possible that males are moving more between wetlands, and our hypothesis was that kind of the effect of interwetland movement on male mortality may offset the effect on female mortality during nesting and result in kind of an even relationship at this this level of wetland aggregation. So again, I'm going to breeze right through these methods. They're the same methods as we applied, same data set, and really we found no support for our prediction. So as a reminder, low aggregations, we thought there would be no relationship. At high aggregations, we thought that there would be a positive relationship with proportion of male cover and land use intensity. We essentially saw the exact opposite pattern. So at low aggregations, we saw that populations were becoming more female biased with greater crop cover, and this relationship essentially dissipated as wetland aggregation increased. This was pretty surprising to us, and it was hard to explain at first until we delved into the research. The cumulative body of research around nesting ecology of the species suggests that females actually, while they do move pretty big distances sometimes away from wetlands, most females nest very close to wetlands, and sometimes even within wetlands, within relatively dry areas, suggesting that their females are relatively less vulnerable to the surrounding landscape than maybe females in other species. On the other hand, males, for some studies, have suggested that males may move more than females, and they may move between wetlands more than females, and this could lead to greater mortality in these less aggregated contexts. So this could explain why we see a more female-biased population in these contexts. So I'd like to move on to the broader findings and implications for this sub-project. In general, I think it really emphasizes that turtle communities are most likely very strongly shaped by the composition and configuration of habitat in the surrounding landscape. We saw that abundance was positively influenced by wetland diversity, and I think this really suggests that our protection efforts should focus on prioritizing wetlands with more varied wetland types, but also more varied hydrological regimes because of it promotes greater diversity of resources. Also suggests that restoration efforts should be more focused on wetland diversity as well. And I want to just throw out the idea that maybe we should be thinking more about beavers and their ability to generate different wetland contexts and these really complex wetland systems and landscapes. More research obviously needs to be conducted on that, though. It also suggests that the destruction and degradation of non-critical wetland habitat may still trigger population decline through its reduction in wetland diversity, even though its primary wetland habitat may still exist. And lastly, I think it suggests that landscapes that harbor higher wetland diversity may sort of function as climate refugia moving into the future because of its ability to promote populations and likely more stable populations, but also its ability to offer a greater variety of resources and microclimates for individuals to regulate their temperature. Wetland configuration, our results suggested that it may determine or modulate the effect of land use on populations. And this really suggests to me that certain land use types might not be strictly good or bad for a population, but strongly dependent upon the landscape context. It also suggests that management plans should be more explicitly considering landscape context when they're deciding how to manage or conserve a population. We found that roads negatively affected spotted turtles, both in terms of abundance and juvenile recruitment. This is a focal species for the NRCS, so that's why I'm calling the species out in particular, and suggests that maybe our restoration efforts should focus more on areas with lower road density, just because of the challenges of mitigating the effects of roads on turtles. With respect to agriculture, we saw negative relationships for both abundance and sex ratio, but it did appear to be dependent upon the surrounding wetland context or wetland aggregation or configuration. So again, suggesting the context dependent of this relationship. And lastly, I think it really supports the overall project, supports the idea that we should really be shifting away from individual wetlands and buffer-based approaches to conservation toward more multi-scale landscape level approaches to conservation that really takes into account species ecology as well as the configuration and composition of the surrounding landscape. So with that, I'd like to just thank my collaborators, as well as the field support, as well as the monetary support. Thank you so much for supporting this project. And with that, I would really love to take any questions that people have.
Great, thank you, Patrick. That was a great presentation. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. I would encourage everybody to put your questions in there. I'll get to these first, and then maybe I'll have a few. First question is, any differences in wetland preferences among the 3 species of turtles that you looked at?
Right. So yes, yeah, there is quite a bit of a range and habitat preferences. So these 3 species here, where one of them species on the left here, we have the eastern box turtle, which actually is more a terrestrial species. So that was the focus of the spatial ecology research. But the wood turtle in center here focuses on as a stream specialist. But they're highly semi-aquatic or semi-terrestrial. They overwinter in streams and mate in streams, but then use the surrounding landscape during most of the active period. The spotted turtle on the right here really specializes in shallow wetlands that are really dynamic. They really change from year to year. They dry up and they flood, often within years as well as between years. And then we focused on a lot of other species here as well, but they focus on they occupy a wide range of different habitats as well.
Okay, thanks. Next one, did you notice any changes in the habitats over time at the first study due to invasive aquatic plant species? And if so, what was the impact on the turtles populations, if you knew that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question and a great question. I think that so that was something we were interested in. It was a really challenging thing to do, partly because these studies were conducted so long ago. In particular, one of them was a spotted turtle that they didn't even actually have great mapping or GPS technology then. So they didn't focus on mapping habitats. So it was kind of a challenging thing to really get at in a quantitative way. So that's not something we were really able to address. But I will say it did seem to we did see kind of some anecdotal evidence that for certain types of invasives and for certain activities, say basking for wood turtle and Japanese knotweed, they did seem to actually use those areas and really didn't seem to be all that affected by the colonization of those areas by Japanese knotweed. Same for Phragmites and spotted turtles during their kind of normal activity period. But we do know that a couple of the nesting areas for several of our populations, not necessarily these spatial ecology populations, but they are regularly colonized or taken over by knotweed and Phragmites, and that can really render those nesting habitats quite unusable. So that's a major concern for most turtle species.
Yeah. This is probably more a comment than a question for you. Somebody said, is there a possibility of NRCS cost sharing on road crossings for amphibians and reptiles? And there's some thumbs up on that. So I guess that's something that you made us think, Patrick.
Yeah.
So thanks for that.
Yeah, sorry.
Another one here. What can you tell us about ag chemical runoff into wetlands and their effect on turtles?
I think that's a great question, and I know very little about that, in part because that's the populations I've studied are not as like that I've actually been in are not as situated within these highly agricultural contexts. Although we're able to sample some across the range, there really hasn't. But the other reason is also there hasn't really been a big effort to study that for a lot of these species that I know well, at least. So I think there's just kind of a big need for it in general.
Yeah, and I guess there's a follow-up question here about, is anyone studying water quality of these habitats to see if there are PFAS and PVA chemicals and the impact of turtle reproduction? And I guess that's part of the. Yeah.
That's a great question. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I think that probably not is the most likely correct answer to that. But I think that it's a great avenue to pursue. Turtles adults tend to be fairly resilient, and I think they do tolerate some level of pollution. But I think that the effect on, say, reproduction or other factors, their annual cycle, I think that there are potential negative consequences there. Although I don't think I know a ton about it, or at least I don't.
Yeah, there's probably a whole other field of research.
Right.
Here's a question: is there any research that indicates success in creating modified road culverts that allow a terrestrial crossing, one side or the other, to provide safer turtle crossing? Have you ever seen anything like that?
Yeah. So that's an active field of research at the moment, and I think it's we're getting there towards some good solutions. Most of them, are kind of limited by our abilities and by money. A lot of our techniques are focused on fencing, and then and directing turtles towards culverts when we can. One of the big challenges is that a lot of these individuals, although they're slow, turtles are slow, they do use sometimes very expansive areas, and they can move quite a bit. So you can never really fence the entire road where a population exists. Although you can identify hotspots and in some cases really effectively manage for those crossing areas. But there have been some promising examples of fences that kind of curl at the outside. So when turtles hit them, they run into that curl and kind of get directed back towards the interior, maybe towards a culvert or back towards that wetland. And there is some evidence to suggest that that is working for that population. But again, it's really hard to fully mitigate all mortality for a population.
Yeah. There's some comments in there about maybe possibly modifying our standards of the aquatic organism passage standard to include turtles. Which, yeah. There's another question here as it relates to road mortality. Did you determine the risk of mortality per crossing? They reference Hell's and Buckwall's mortality risk modeling framework.
Right. So I think that would require spatial ecology, movement related research. Which for our movement related research, we really focused on site fidelity within these populations that weren't particularly situated near roads. So roads wasn't really a factor within that spatial ecology study. The road component came out in this population level study where we were mainly just sampling through traps. So I think we would need to track individuals to understand those questions. But I think it's possible, and it's something I really want to explore. And we're starting to get toward solar-powered GPS technology that would really allow us to get a better, closer look at the relationship between individuals and roads. So it's definitely a project that I'm interested in exploring in the future.
Okay, great. There's probably time for one more question, then we'll probably have to wrap it up here. But this is an interesting one. Landowners can do their part to conserve the landscape, but what can they do about fighting poaching? The turtle trade.
Yeah, that is a really challenging question. I think there are some intractable or seemingly intractable kind of components of the poaching aspect. It's one unfortunate aspect of turtle conservation is that most people feel the need to conceal population locations because of the tendency for people to revisit them, and sometimes poachers catch wind of ideal populations and really just take essentially all the individuals out of that population, and leading to kind of immediate extirpation of the population. So that's a really big fear, I think, for a lot of our state agencies across the eastern U.S. And there isn't a great solution. We tried to conceal the location of populations, and there are some efforts. There's a great kind of working group called the Collaborative to Combat Trade in Turtles is what it's called, CCITT. I would direct anybody toward that group that formed now 4 or 5 years ago. But they're really trying to tackle this issue, including looking for stiffer penalties, and kind of educating prosecutors and judges around the subject, but also kind of advocating for kind of more widespread, potentially, laws that could kind of focus on this real big concern, kind of the way that we have certain laws for birds as well.
Yeah. Well, we'll work on that while we stay in our lane and work on the habitat.
Right. Yep.
All right. So with that, Patrick, I want to thank you again. I'm going to turn it back over to Creech to have some closing comments. And so thanks again, everybody, and take over, Creech.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you to our acting regional conservationist. This was a real treat today. We got some great engagement in the questions, which for me always means we're doing something right. So thank you to all of you who attended. Thank you for asking those great questions. I went ahead and put this in the chat. So if you need to hop early or hop right on time, I should say, please do. But if you could hang around for maybe 90 more seconds, we'll just go through a few pieces. So if you're curious about this webinar and resources with this or up and coming webinars, you can find pretty much anything you need for this webinar series at nrcs.usda.gov/conservation-outcomes-webinar. And that link is in the chat. I encourage you to favorite it. We have webinars. We'll have at least one more this year. We always try to provide a good and diverse lineup. You can also sign up for Gov Delivery. If you sign up for our Conservation Outcomes webinar notifications, you'll get those directly to your inbox. You'll also get other publications we may have related to conservation outcomes. And if you're curious about today's webinar recording or slides from Dr. Roberts, those will be available on that webpage by early October. Also, if you're curious about our Conservation Effects Assessment Project, you can access that at nrcs.usda.gov/CEAP. And I also shared our email addresses on the screen. So please, if you have other ideas, other questions, don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to serve you. And then finally, we have another exciting wildlife-related webinar coming up. So please save the date, November 16th, 2023. We'll focus on outcomes of spatial targeting in sagebrush country via the Sage Grouse Initiative. So looking forward to that one as well. Again, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you, and we'll see you next time.